Ukraine denies any responsibility for the strikes. It's still unclear who is behind them. No, the Russian drones are responsible for these nightly bombardments of Kyiv. What's going on the other side?
Don't know who was behind those drone attacks, the ones we all saw exploding over the Kremlin a week or so ago.
What if I told you a 6-minute, 48-second operation was enough to shut down one of Russia's most critical supply lines to the south? This wasn't just a drone strike. It was a carefully choreographed attack that burned through tankers, twisted rails into wreckage, and silenced an entire railway artery. But the real question is, how did a smaller force manage to paralyze a billion-dollar supply command? Stay with me, because once you see how Ukraine pulled this off, you'll understand why logistics, not tanks, are deciding this war.
This is a very, very long border, and it's probably not far off 2,000 kilometers long, so it's quite complicated for the Russian forces to be able to control that border. It could be the Ukrainian army. That appears pretty uncertain or uncertain because Ukraine has no real interest in launching an attack against Russia right now. So the question now is, who is responsible for those attacks into Russia from Ukraine?
Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So did you click the subscribe button? Great, thank you so much. Now back to the video. Imagine a railway that pumps fuel, ammunition, and troops down toward a battlefield suddenly going silent in less than 7 minutes.
The question is it the Ukrainians who are funding them? Is it the Ukrainians who are giving them weapons and tanks? Or are they receiving them when they get into Russian territory? What has happened to this 3-day war when we were supposed to walk in there and take control of Ukraine via this special military operation, as the Russians call it? The war is now coming closer to home, and that would lead to a fall in the popularity ratings of Vladimir Putin. False flag operation is, of course, Russia, which is attacking itself to make it look like it was Ukraine coming into Russian territory.
The Kursk-Belgorod line isn't just a set of steel tracks. It's one of the narrow corridors connecting Russia's northern interior with the routes feeding Crimea and the southern fronts. Every day, trains packed with diesel, gasoline, and armored vehicles crush through its junctions, rushing toward the combat zones. Russia knows its importance. That's why the line has long been protected not only by armed security, but also by electronic shields, convoy escorts, and interference systems designed to keep saboteurs and small drones away. On paper, it should be one of the hardest rail arteries in the country to crack. On the ground, it turned into one of the most vulnerable once Ukraine made the decision to strike it in layers, step by step, with machines that didn't need sleep or fear. The operation began with the simplest piece: eyes in the sky. Ukrainian spotter drones flew low, hugging terrain and gliding just above the tree line to avoid radar sweeps. From 20 meters up, camera feeds streamed back to controllers watching in command rooms miles away. Within seconds of crossing into the monitored corridor, those unarmed scouts picked out the target: a chain of fuel cars parked side by side, their tanks glistening from spilled residue under floodlights.
NATO agreed, NATO countries, with Ukraine to give supplies of weapons not to fire into Russia. Ukraine denies it, but I think that's causing consternation NATO-wide, isn't it?
Or is it legitimate defense? I don't think anybody on the Ukrainian side is particularly unhappy about the fact that Russia is getting a taste of its own medicine, but in some of the European capitals there is alarm about this. There is fear in the US that this could lead to a much wider conflict and spread out wider than just Ukraine itself, and then bring the West in as well, which would then be directly in conflict with the Russians.
Even submerged in heavy jamming, the drones pushed telemetry through encrypted bursts, sending GPS locks and thermal signatures directly to strike units. Russian operators scrambled to jam signals, flooding the bandwidth with noise, but it was like trying to drown a whistle in a hurricane. The data squeezed through anyway. Then came the second layer: impact units. 7 Maluka Phi-2 drones, each loaded with explosive warheads, dropped from holding patterns on the outskirts and angled toward the railway. Built to dive like birds of prey, they accelerated in near silence until the final sprint, at which point their engines screamed and alerts lit up Russian monitors. By the time defenders realized what was incoming, the drones were already seconds away. Two slammed into the lead tankers, blowing them apart and blasting burning fuel into the air. Three more struck the middle of the convoy, instantly turning steel containers into ruptured bombs. The last pair finished the line, triggering further blasts as the chain reaction leapt from car to car. Flames rolled backward and forward, spreading through wagons and igniting a fireball that stretched nearly 200 meters. Steel warped and wheels tore loose from tracks. The air shattered with echoed detonations as diesel and gasoline turned the rail into a furnace. And then Ukraine brought in a third layer, the insurance. Additional drones weren't only packed with charges, they carried jamming pods and repeater nodes. As the first explosions roared, these backups hovered high enough to mask communication waves, crushing Russian defenses in static. Ground crews trying to coordinate firefighting efforts or scramble counter-drones found their radios useless. Automated sensors that should have cued interceptors blinked dead. At the same time, a handful of reserve drones dove into surviving cars, striking whatever had not yet been consumed. In less than 7 minutes, all phases overlapped into one rolling disaster. Rail lines buckled into twisted arcs, several wagons derailed sideways off ballast, and flames draped over cross ties. The air filled with smoke heavy enough to obscure satellites tracing the event. By the clock, the main sequence of destruction lasted 6 minutes and 48 seconds. That brief window was enough to halt transport entirely. No recovery team could roll in with the line still aflame, and no repair crews could approach until the last tanker bled out its fire. It wasn't just another strike on a fuel depot. It became a blockade. For 72 hours, that artery remained sealed, cutting off supplies exactly when Russia pressed for momentum in the southern zone. Trains stacked up in waiting stations, tank units starved for fuel, and forward bases rationed their reserves. The careful orchestration of UAV spotting, kamikaze swarms, and electronic warfare had turned one supply corridor into a dead end at the moment it mattered most. And if 7 minutes of assaults could immobilize trains, the bigger question was still waiting. What happened when Ukraine turned those tactics against the depots feeding the entire Southern Command? This single raid proves something most military theorists have written about for decades. Crippling a fuel line can outweigh the arrival of new tanks or artillery. A rail artery carries more than fuel. It carries momentum, and once it stops, the units on the front stop with it. Now imagine that concept on a global stage. If small teams with autonomous drones can block regional supply chains, what happens to worldwide shipping lanes or oil routes in future conflicts? The battlefield isn't only about who fires hardest anymore. It's about who can turn technology into disruption that lasts.